The man stood in his kitchen holding an envelope with one number written across the front. $18,250. He stared at it for a few seconds. Then he looked at the tiny stack of receipts beside it. Coffee, takeout, a streaming subscription, a convenience store snack, a few dollars here, $5 there. Nothing about the envelope looked extraordinary. And yet, 20 years earlier, the amount inside would have sounded almost ridiculous. $5. That was all. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside wasn't a lottery ticket. There was no inheritance letter. No secret investment deal. No lucky stock pick that had exploded overnight. Just a printed statement. His eyes moved down the page, then stopped. For the first time, he smiled. Not because he had suddenly become rich. Because he finally understood what those $5 decisions had been doing when he wasn't paying attention. Liam. And the strange part is, if you had watched him during those 20 years, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything happening. The man didn't look like someone building wealth. He still remembered worrying about bills. He still remembered checking his bank balance before buying something unnecessary. He still remembered days when $5 felt too small to matter, and days when $5 felt too expensive to spare. So why was he holding an envelope with $18,250 written on it? And why did that number represent only the beginning of the story? Because the envelope wasn't really about the money he had put away. It was about what happened to the money he almost didn't put away. And to understand that, we have to go back to the first $5. 20 years earlier, that first $5 didn't look like the beginning of anything. It looked like money he could spend in about 30 seconds. Back then, the man lived in an ordinary apartment where the kitchen was barely big enough for two people to stand in at once. His paycheck arrived, disappeared into rent, groceries, transportation, bills, and the random expenses that always seemed to appear at exactly the wrong time. He wasn't broke, but he wasn't comfortable either. There was a difference. He could occasionally buy something he wanted, but larger expenses made him nervous. A car repair could ruin an entire month. A medical bill could force him to postpone something else. Even a small increase in rent could make him stare at his budget longer than he wanted to admit. And then there were the tiny purchases. $5 for a drink. $5 for food on the way home. $5 spent because cooking dinner suddenly felt like too much effort. None of those purchases felt dangerous. That's what made them dangerous. One evening, he looked at his spending and noticed something uncomfortable. He wasn't losing money through one giant mistake. He was leaking it through hundreds of tiny decisions. So he tried something almost embarrassingly simple. Every day, he would set aside $5. Not $500. Not half his paycheck. $5. He opened a separate investment account and arranged for the money to move automatically. The first transfer felt strangely serious. His balance increased by $5. Then another $5. Then another. After a week, he had roughly $35. He looked at the number and almost laughed. What was this supposed to accomplish? At that pace, he wasn't going to buy a house. He wasn't going to retire early. He wasn't even going to feel rich. But he kept going, because the real experiment wasn't about whether $5 could make him wealthy. It was about whether he could keep making the decision after the excitement disappeared. And that turned out to be much harder than he expected. The first month gave him an answer, but not the one he wanted. The money was growing so slowly that he started wondering whether the entire idea was pointless. For the first few months, nothing dramatic happened. His account went from a few dollars to a few dozen, then a few hundred. He watched the balance occasionally, waiting for some sign that he was doing something important. Usually, there wasn't one. Meanwhile, life kept demanding money. His phone broke. His rent increased. A weekend trip came up. There were birthdays, dinners, repairs, subscriptions, unexpected purchases, the normal little traps that turn a monthly budget into a guessing game. Several times, he considered stopping the $5 transfers. One evening, he sat on the edge of his bed with his banking app open. The investment balance wasn't impressive. He could withdraw the money and suddenly have cash available. For a moment, that sounded much more useful than some distant future. Then he closed the app. The next morning, another $5 moved automatically. That was when something subtle changed. He stopped thinking of the investment as money he had to find. It became money that simply wasn't available to spend. And that mattered, because investing isn't only about choosing an asset or watching a number rise. It's also about creating a system that makes your future decision before your present mood gets a vote. Liam, think about that. The man didn't become more disciplined overnight. He built a situation where discipline was required less often. There was another reason the balance started behaving differently. The money wasn't sitting completely still. In this hypothetical example, suppose his investments averaged 8% annually over the long run, with all the usual uncertainty and no guarantee that real markets would behave that way. His own contributions were still tiny. But now the money he had already invested could potentially earn returns too. And those returns could themselves earn returns. At first, the effect was almost invisible. That was the frustrating part. The snowball hadn't become a snowball yet. It was still just a little piece of snow in his hand. But 20 years is a very long time for a little thing to keep moving. Then came the first moment when the account grew by more than he had contributed that month. And suddenly, the $5 experiment looked different. He noticed it on an ordinary morning. He had just made his usual contribution when he checked the account. The balance was higher than he expected. Not dramatically higher, just enough to make him pause. Some of the growth hadn't come from his paycheck. It had come from the investments. That distinction stayed with him. Until then, he had imagined wealth as something you built by working more hours and earning more money. Now he was watching another possibility. Money could potentially produce more money while he was sleeping. Of course, it wasn't smooth. Some months looked better. Some looked worse. There were periods when the account fell, and the falling number bothered him far more than the rising number excited him. One afternoon, after seeing a sharp decline, he nearly changed everything. He thought, maybe I should just wait until things look safer. But that sentence contained a trap. If he only invested when everything looked safe, he might spend his entire life waiting for a moment that didn't exist. So he kept the automatic $5 contribution running. Not because he knew what the market would do next. He didn't. He simply knew what his own system was supposed to do next. And the years began accumulating. One calendar page disappeared, then another. His contribution total slowly climbed. At $5 every day, a simple 365-day year would mean about $1,825 contributed. Over 20 years, ignoring leap year differences for simplicity, that's $18,250 of his own money. That number finally sounded substantial. But something else was happening beneath it. The longer the money remained invested, the more time those earlier dollars had to potentially compound. His first $5 had almost 20 years to work. A $5 he invested near the end wouldn't. Same amount, completely different amount of time. And that difference was beginning to matter. He was no longer asking whether $5 was enough. He was starting to ask a more uncomfortable question. Where did all those early dollars become because he gave them time? Around the middle of the 20-year journey, something happened that had nothing to do with the stock market. He got a raise. It wasn't life-changing, but it changed his thinking. For years, he had treated the $5 as the investment. Now, he realized the more important thing was the habit behind it. So instead of spending every extra dollar, he increased the automatic contribution. 5 became 7. Later, it became 10. Not every day was perfect, and not every increase lasted forever. There were months when expenses forced him to cut back. There were periods when he simply forgot why he had started. But the basic idea survived. His income changed. His responsibilities changed. His apartment changed. His priorities changed. The $5 decision changed too. And that created an unexpected contrast. The original $5 had been tiny compared with his income, but the habit had become larger than the original amount. Liam, that's one of the quiet powers of starting small. The first amount doesn't have to remain the final amount. It only has to be small enough that you actually begin. He also learned something that no chart could make emotionally obvious. Compounding is slow at first. If you put money into an investment account, you don't immediately see a dramatic transformation. For a long time, your contributions do most of the visible work. Then, If the investments grow over time, the growth itself can become increasingly important. That doesn't mean returns are guaranteed. They aren't. It doesn't mean an 8% average happens every year. It doesn't. It means that in a hypothetical long-term scenario, time can change the relationship between what you contribute and what your money potentially becomes. And now he had reached the dangerous middle. He had already worked for years. He had enough invested to care about the number, but he still had years left. That made quitting strangely tempting. The hardest part wasn't starting. It was continuing after the habit had become boring and just before time had finished doing its most important work. The next few years didn't feel like a financial transformation. They felt like life. He went to work. He came home tired. He paid bills. He occasionally overspent. He fixed things that broke. He bought things he didn't need. He sometimes checked his investment account and sometimes went weeks without looking. That might sound disappointing. It was actually the point. The strategy wasn't supposed to require him to think about money every hour. The automatic contribution kept happening quietly in the background. And while he was busy living, the calendar kept moving. 5 years became 10. 10 became 15. The investment balance began telling a story his memory couldn't. Every contribution had a timestamp attached to it. Some had been invested during good periods, some during bad periods, some when he felt confident, others when he was worried. He couldn't predict which days would turn out to be the best or worst. So instead of trying to predict them, he had simply kept showing up. This is where the $5 became more than $5. Imagine two people. One starts putting away $5 a day at the beginning of a 20-year period. Another waits until the final few years and tries to catch up with much larger contributions. The second person may eventually invest more aggressively, but they can't buy back the years the first person already had. Time is not something you can deposit into an account later. And that was becoming the hidden advantage of the man's tiny decision. Not the size, the head start. By now, the original kitchen was gone. The old phone was gone. Several jobs had come and gone. The man himself looked different. But one thing had followed him through all of it. The automatic transfer. $5 at a time. And then, one evening, he opened the account and saw a number that made him sit down. He wasn't looking at his contributions anymore. He was looking at what time had done to them. The number wasn't the ending yet. It was a clue. And suddenly, the envelope from the beginning was getting much closer. The number on his screen stayed there for several seconds. He refreshed the page, then refreshed it again. It hadn't changed. He opened the transaction history. There it was. Years of tiny deposits. $5, $5, $5. Thousands of ordinary decisions stacked quietly on top of one another. Then he noticed something that made the number even more surprising. His own contributions weren't the whole balance. The account had grown beyond what he had personally put into it. Not because he had discovered some secret, not because every investment had gone up, but because money that stayed invested had been given time to potentially grow. And then grow again. Liam, this is the part people often miss. Compounding doesn't feel powerful when you're watching it month by month. It becomes much easier to notice when you zoom out. So he zoomed out. 5 years. 10. 15. 20. The early years looked almost boring. The later years looked different. Not guaranteed. Not predictable. Just the mathematical effect of allowing potential returns to remain invested and compound over time. And suddenly, the little $5 didn't look little anymore. It represented thousands of days. Thousands of mornings when he went to work. Thousands of nights when he came home tired. Thousands of ordinary days when nothing about his life looked financially extraordinary. But financially, something extraordinary had been happening quietly. He thought about all the times he almost stopped. The broken phone, the expensive month, the falling market, the moments when $5 genuinely felt useful somewhere else. None of those moments felt important when they happened. Together, they had shaped 20 years. And now he was standing on the edge of the final number. But before he could understand the number, he had to separate one thing from another. The money he had contributed and the money time had potentially created. 20 years after that first $5 transfer, the man finally stopped scrolling. He looked at the total contributions first. There it was, approximately $18,250. That was the money he had actually put in, using the simplified 365-day year calculation. Then he looked at the total account value. For this hypothetical example, if the investments averaged 8% annually over the entire period, with contributions made daily and returns compounded, the ending value would be roughly $45,600. Not $18,250. Roughly $45,600. The difference, about $27,350, would represent growth beyond his original contributions under that hypothetical assumption. And that's the moment the envelope from the beginning finally makes sense. It wasn't an envelope filled with money he had magically found. It represented 20 years of tiny decisions. $5 on an ordinary day. $5 when he was tired. $5 when he was tempted to spend it. $5 when the market was falling. He didn't know which contribution would matter most. He didn't know which year would be the strongest. He didn't know what the market would do next. He only knew that the money had been given something incredibly valuable. Time. And time had allowed the small contributions to potentially become something much larger. That's the part that gets lost when people look only at the daily amount. $5 sounds small. 20 years doesn't. And the most interesting part wasn't that he had somehow found a shortcut to wealth. He hadn't. He had simply made one tiny decision often enough for time to become part of the equation. But there was still one question left. What would that $45,600 actually mean to him after 20 years? And why did that number matter more than simply being a bigger bank balance? 20 years earlier, the man had looked at $5 and seen something he could spend. 20 years later, he looked at the same amount and saw time. That's the full circle moment. The envelope on the kitchen table wasn't really a celebration of $18,250. It was a record of 3,650 ordinary decisions in a simplified 20-year calculation. Most of them were invisible. No applause. No dramatic breakthrough. No day when he woke up and suddenly felt wealthy. Just another transfer. Another week. Another month. Another year. And eventually, enough time had passed for the tiny decision to become difficult to ignore. Liam, that's what makes this story powerful. The question was never really, can $5 make you rich? The better question was, what happens when you stop asking whether a small amount is worth starting with? Because $5 a day isn't guaranteed to become $45,000. The assumed 8% return isn't guaranteed. Markets don't move in straight lines. And 20 years doesn't make investing risk-free. But the underlying idea survives all of that. If you can invest consistently, keep costs and taxes in mind, understand what you're investing in, and give your money time, small contributions can become much more meaningful than they look at the beginning. The man folded the statement and put it back into the envelope. Then he did something unexpected. He didn't celebrate by buying something expensive. He opened his investment account and made another contribution. $5. Not because he needed another 20 years to prove the point. Because now he understood what the first $5 had really purchased. It had purchased a possibility. A future where one ordinary decision could quietly become thousands of other decisions. And maybe that's the strangest thing about money. The moments that change your financial life don't always look important when they happen. Sometimes they're barely noticeable. Sometimes they're just $5. Until 20 years later, you finally look back and realize that was the moment everything started. And if the first $5 was capable of becoming a story this big, the real question isn't what $5 could do 20 years ago. It's what your first $5 could start doing now.